Welcome to CSC Movie Recaps. Today I will discuss the Netflix hit Johnny from 2023. Sea levels rise due to rapid climate change in the near future, and humanity decides to relocate to space. They construct shelters between the orbital planes of the Earth and the Moon and spend decades relocating the majority of the population there. As humanity has settled down, Shelters 8, 12, and 13 declare themselves the Adrian Republic and begin fighting the other shelters, launching a decades-long conflict with the Allied force. Now, the humans who remain on Earth must make armaments and parts for the robots deployed in this fight. The Army's best soldier is the legendary Captain John Yi, who is currently recovering from an explosion in an abandoned village. There are robots pursuing her, and she defends herself instantly with precise shots and inventive use of the hook that comes with her weapon. The humanoid robots are easy to beat, but soon a new tougher variant with 4 legs arises, making it more difficult to combat alone. John Yi selects strategic hiding areas and shocks the robot with a shot that sets it on fire, but the robot has its own set of extinguishers and is soon back in action. When the robot approaches, John Yi uses the hook to gather a number of metal beams together and lower them on top of it, successfully trapping it. Then she hides behind a car for her final photo, only to be distracted by a small doll hanging from the car's rear-view mirror. Her diversion allows the robot to fire her first, and John Yi is pushed back, but when she looks at her injured hand, she realizes she is an android and has no idea. Suddenly, an alarm sounds, and the town vanishes. It turns out that this isn't the genuine John Yi. She perished in a war decades ago. A group of scientists is now attempting to construct the perfect soldier robot that can be replicated and sent to war using a copy of her brain. There hasn't been much progress since. In the simulations that reproduce John last year's battle, she constantly loses in the same area, and no one knows why. The crew is led by Jung On-ye's daughter Seo-hyun, who has to see her mother's face die over and over. There's also Sang-hoon, the project's director, who plans to make a special presentation for the Army's higher-ups to promote their android, which they call Jung Yi. Sang-hoon's presentation includes fine food and a recap of the war's history, but the generals are bored and want him to skip over what they already know. The film describes how they are mapping John Brain Yi's cortex and translating it to data in order to create the most advanced military command AI ever, and then Seo-hyun shows how the simulations have been capturing behavioral patterns. The generals observe, however, that the android has not yet fled the simulation, and the entire point is that if John Yi hadn't lost that fight, they would have already won the war. The government will not fund this project unless the team solves John Yi's final blunder. Seo-hyun and Sang-hoon have a private meeting after the presentation. Sang-hoon assures Seo-hyun that she has his full backing and that the chairman has high expectations for her. He began working for the chairman 10 years ago, but he knows Seo-hyun was taken in when she was a little girl who had lost her mother, so Sang-hoon values having a strong working connection with her. Following that, Seo-hyun collaborates with newcomer Jae-kyung to figure out what's wrong with their latest model. The remaining fragments of Jung Yi are awoken, and because the brain still thinks of itself as human, the fake Jung Yi freaked out at finding herself as a robot and begins suffering in anguish. Seo-hyun instantly disables the pain sensors, allowing Jung Yi to unleash her rage, and she wants to know what they did to her. This replica of the brain appears to be too damaged to continue working on, so Seo-hyun orders its destruction. Now that they've finished for the day, Jae-kyung takes the opportunity to emphasize how pleased he is to work here because he's always been a huge fan of Jung Yi, referring to her as a hero. Seo-hyun reveals that Jung Yi never wanted to be a hero. She only entered the war as a mercenary to pay for Seo-hyun's treatments after doctors discovered a tumor in her lungs when she was a youngster. She cried every time her mother went to war, and the day of her surgery also happened to be her mother's death. Seo-hyun occasionally worries if her mother regrets making such a sacrifice and resents her for it, prompting Jae-kyung to point out that she could just question the android, who shares the actual Jung Yi's memories. Seo-hyun says she'll think about it, but she appears to be too afraid to try. Seo-hyun then departs for the day, taking the local train, where she observes a mother engaging with her child. This reminds her of the last time she saw her mother. Seo-hyun was getting ready for surgery, and Jung Yi stopped by to wish her luck before departing for combat. Jung Yi had vowed to return and held Seo-hyun passionately, rubbing his lucky cheek. When the train arrives at its destination, Seo-hyun goes to take her annual ethics test, which everyone is required to take to verify they aren't an android and consists of questions on feelings and morals. She then visits her doctor, who confirms that the tumor has returned to her lungs and that she only has 3 months to live. This means her childhood surgery and her mother's sacrifice were in vain. The doctor advises that the best course of action would be to immediately clone her brain and transfer it to a prosthetic body, as regulations now protect people who do so. They only safeguard those who do this with Type A, which is quite expensive. There's also Kind B, which is less expensive but gives up rights like marriage, freedom of movement, and adoption, and the government wants compliance in order for her to provide them access to her brain data. She may also choose Type C, which does not treat people as humans at all. It relinquishes ownership of brain data to certified organizations. This means that thousands of clones will be created, and the person using this choice will no longer be an individual, but at least the prosthetic will be free. Jung-yi had chosen Type C to obtain the surgical funds for her daughter. Seo-hyun says she'll think about it and leaves the doctor to recharge because he, too, is an android. As Seo-hyun walks out of the building, she recalls the day the company's higher-ups came to her house and asked her grandmother to sign an agreement allowing them to utilize Jung-yi's brain on androids, in exchange for paying for Seo-hyun's upbringing. They also gave Seo-hyun an action figure of Jung-yi, assuring that her mother will always be a hero, but Seo-hyun is still confused whether it was the correct decision. Seo-hyun concludes her day by paying a visit to her mother's comatose body, which is housed in a separate chamber to prevent the brain from rotting. The following day, Seo-hyun creates a new clone of the brain and prepares to test it on a new simulation. But first, Sang-hoon wants to try something different to see if he can obtain a different result, so he instructs the team to shoot the android in the leg before they begin. When Jung-yi awakens in the simulation, she is in excruciating pain due to the leg wound, and it pains Seo-hyun to see how her mother is suffering. Jung-yi attempts to fight through the pain, but she's easily overpowered, and her will to fight starts to dwindle down. When the opponent is poised to kill her, a new area in her brain lights up, and Jung-yi stands up to continue fighting, defeating the robot with her fists before being shot by a different enemy. It's unfortunate that they've already lost this new brain, but Sang-hoon is pleased by this discovery and eager to show it off to the higher-ups. The following day, the entire crew leaves the labs and travels to the corporate offices, but the chairman is not present. Instead, they are greeted by the new product development department chief, who keeps giggling at Sang-hoon and not taking him seriously. Sang-hoon is perplexed by the need for a product development department because the company has never had one before because it solely makes weapons, and he is concerned that weapons development will be reduced, but his concerns are not heeded and the team is sent away without answers. Sang-hoon insults the new employee on the way back to the labs and promises he'll keep the chairman's dream alive. A few days later, the crew is searching for new parts for their next android test when they are alerted that the chairman has arrived. On the way to the conference, Sang-hoon inquires if Seo-hyun has been taking her ethics test, as it is critical for them to ensure she is psychologically stable while dealing with her own mother as an experiment. As soon as the couple enters the room, Sang-hoon freezes, showing he's actually an android that the chairman constructed by copying his own brain, but Sang-hoon has no idea. The chairman has arrived with very important news. The Allied Force and the Adrian Republic are signing a pact, which means the conflict is finished and weapons are no longer required. He doesn't think the Jung-yi research was in vain because it taught them a lot about constructing good AIS, which they can now utilize to create housekeeping and service worker androids. The chairman admits that his original goal was to transplant his own brain into Sang-hoon in order to attain immortality, but he ultimately cloned it because he didn't want to live within a machine that would never stop feeling false. Seo-hyun doesn't care how phony it is, she wants to continue working on her mother's initiative, but the chairman refuses. After a few hours, the crew returns to work because the project must be completed properly before they change goals. Sang-hoon becomes enraged since they can't trigger that new brain area again to isolate it, and he believes it's time for some drastic ideas. Sang-hoon instructs the crew to activate the android and cut her arm, forcing Seo-hyun to witness her agony as the pain section of her brain reaches agonizing levels. However, the new brain section remains dark, and a desperate Sang-hoon attempts to shoot the android's legs next to match the wound from the previous day. To alleviate Jung-yi's suffering, Seo-hyun cracks and switches off the system, prompting an infuriated Sang-hoon to threaten her with his gun. This is insufficient to frighten Seo-hyun, and she maintains her position. But, before Sang-hoon can go too far, another employee arrives to inform him that the chairman wishes to see him. Sang-hoon walks away without saying anything, and Seo-hyun thanks her staff for their efforts. It's time to call it quits on the project, but she does ask them to compile all of the data they've gathered and give it to her. Sometime later, Seo-hyun ignores the ache in her lungs and focuses on the facts. Unbeknownst to her, someone had exported her mother's brain one last time without her knowledge. Seo-hyun goes to investigate, and as she walks by Jae-kyung's room, she hears some strange noises and enters. What she discovers there is somewhat disturbing. Jae-kyung has been having an affair with a new robot engineered to execute terrible actions while still wearing Jung Hwi-ai's face. A furious Seo-hyun knocks Jae-kyung against the shelves and accuses him for being a pervert after covering the android with a blanket, but Jae-kyung claims he was merely following orders. It turns out that producing companions capable of intimacy is part of constructing Home-A.I.S, and because Jung-yi was so famous, people would pay a lot of money to have her as their girlfriend. Jung Hwi-ai's persona, after all, is Type C, which means she may be exploited by anyone. Devastated by the news, Seo-hyun sobs her way out of the room, recognizing how she should have seen it coming when they gave her an action figure of her own deceased mother. Seo-hyun returns to the lab a minute later to spend time with the android before the research is terminated. Sang-hoon is already there, depressed since he believes he lost the chairman's trust and hence their idea was terminated. Seo-hyun walks into the android room, awakening her up after turning off the pain sensors. Once she has Jung Hwi-ai's attention, Seo-hyun informs her that they have rescued her from the enemy and that she is severely injured, so she will assist her in dying gently. As Jung-yi asks if her daughter survived the procedure, the brain area they were seeking for eventually lights up again as Seo-hyun is about to turn her off. Seo-hyun begins to cry as she learns that both times this brain area reacted because Jung-yi felt she would die without knowing about her baby, and she informs her that the surgery was a success, allowing her to live on in peace. Jung-yi is relieved to hear this and reveals she's been feeling bad because she lost the little doll her daughter gave her before leaving for the surgery, which was intended to be a good luck charm, during the battle. That's why she always gets lost in the same place, seeing the little doll in the car and being tortured by guilt distract her. Seo-hyun, unable to hear this any longer, switches her off and has a full collapse, crying with her own guilt. She knows there's one more thing she can do after that's out of her system. The following day, Seo-hyun demands one last simulation before shutting everything down. She informs the other team members she'll put things up on her own, and then Seo-hyun deletes the unnamed part of Jung Hwi-ai's brain. Then she starts whispering in her ear about all the bad things that will happen to her after the last simulation is complete if they don't do something. When the final simulation begins, Jung-yi follows the standard battle tactics and dies in the same location. Jae-kyung notices some strange signals showing that the brain's response was weaker, but Sang-hoon is unconcerned because the project is already over. The other staff carry the robot away, and Sang-hoon is on his way to his room when he realizes he, too, has seen something unusual. He runs back to the lab and requests that the simulation be repeated in slow motion, allowing him to determine that Jung-yi had not been shot. She nearly feigned to fall and landed in the usual position. Sang-hoon instantly triggers the alarm, and Jung-yi responds by knocking out the staff who are transporting her. When everyone prepares for an emergency, Seo-hyun returns to the lab and deletes all of the original project data. Jung-yi looks for a way out and stumbles and finds a room filled with dozens of robots that resemble her. Before she can accept this, Sang-hoon's armed security robots track her down, resulting in a deadly struggle. Jung-yi, on the other hand, is a legendary fighter for a reason, and she effortlessly defeats them all. Even when a robot knocks her up against a maintenance machine, she seizes the opportunity to turn the equipment against her attacker. One of the robots suddenly takes advantage of her blind spot and kicks her from behind before slamming her into the wall to murder her. At that precise moment, Seo-hyun appears and disables the robot just in time. Then she tells Jung-yi that they're in this together, and Jung-yi believes her since she's heard her voice in her nightmares. A second wave of security robots arrives at the hangar minutes later, and they let another android carry Seo-hyun away before shooting at Jung-yi. When they examine the body, they discover Jung-body-yi's is empty. Examining the surveillance cameras reveals that Seo-hyun moved the brain copy from the regular body to a security android in order to escape unobserved, leaving the body with her mother's face behind to full security. Seo-hyun drags Jung-yi into the train, only to learn that it isn't as empty as she had hoped. Sang-hoon is waiting for them. As the train takes off, Sang-hoon accuses Seo-hyun of being ungrateful for everything the chairman's done for her and tells Jung-yi to step away from her daughter. Jung-yi is taken aback when she realizes this is her little kid, but Seo-hyun interrupts to explain that she's removed all the data about herself from her memories, so she sacrifices. Sang-hoon shoots Seo-hyun in the shoulder in retaliation for destroying the project, forcing Jung-yi to confront him and shoot him with his own gun. Sang-hoon swiftly jumps up to continue fighting, but freezes as he sees his reflection in the window. The shot's damage has revealed his true nature as an android. Seo-hoon refers to him as the chairman's little toy, which drives Sang-hoon insane. Now he can activate the abilities of his android body, and Sang-hoon attacks Jung-yi, starting the fight that throws their bodies all over the cabin and causes the train to shake on the rails. Sang-hoon succeeds in shoving Jung-yi through the window after exchanging a few blows, but she lets go on purpose in order to crawl around the train and re-enter it from a different window. At that point, other security robots come on a parallel railway and connect both wagons. They pursue Jung-yi by jumping through the windows as well, but Jung-yi easily defeats them all with accurate strikes. Sang-hoon uses this distraction to trap her, and when Seo-hoon sees her mother in distress, she tries to stop the robot from harming her. Although the robot easily pushes Seo-hoon away, seeing her daughter in danger motivates Jung-yi to become more aggressive. She smashes all of the remaining robots and throws Sang-hoon out of the train, but he manages to get back in by clutching onto the hook. The train arrives in the city as Sang-hoon and Jung-yi resume fighting, and the shaking of two attached wagons becomes too much for the tracks to sustain. Seo-hoon manages to snag one of the weapons dropped by the robots and shoots a hook for Jung-yi to grab, allowing her mother to safely return to the first wagon while they let the second wagon fall with Sang-hoon within. When the train reaches the Alpine area, it finally comes to a halt. Jung-yi wants to treat Seo-hoon's wound, but they can hear the cops arriving, so Seo-hoon says that she doesn't have much time left. She wants Jung-yi to flee and establish a new life where she can focus on herself instead of her kid. With some difficulty, Jung-yi accepts this proposal, but not before hugging Seo-hoon and giving her a lucky cheek rub as she used to do as a child. As Jung-yi exits the train, Seo-hoon bids for her success and dies alone, feeling she has found closure. Jung-yi flees through the mountains, away from any humans who might wish to use her once more.